today, a very exciting episode. We speak with my buddy John Callahan, aka Bunker Cal, right from back in the day. He is our
Yes.
creator, host of the Great Unlearn podcast, and a principal at Unlearn Ventures, an investment fund and incubator for forward-thinking projects. He's been on a journey to explore the great unlearning in order to align to creation and help others through his journey on how to do this. Welcome to the Activate Your Audience podcast.
Dude, Bunker Cal, that is from the archives.
Dude, I
Yeah,
still
that was
have the workouts as like saved screenshots that I'll do to this day.
no way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, just to give people a little context, I was a trader in Chicago from 95 until 2013, and when I left, I would say the last probably 6 years of trading, I really got into fitness and health and wellness and the like, and started a bit of a coaching program for a brief period of time. It really went, head first into that. And one of the things I did, place I would work out in Chicago is my garage. Here in Austin, I have its own separate structure. It's called the Bunker. Is my name for it. So yeah, my Instagram handle was Bunker Cal for a long time.
Yeah, OG. There's definitely a lot of magic that I'm sure happened there and what may be processed into the great unlearning. Maybe like one of the first things, right? Your body connection to getting into this next phase of life, would you say?
Wow, it's actually making me a little emotional. There was so much about my life in that period, I was really trying to make it. I think a lot of us have this idea that we're trying to make it and that we're never there. And fitness was a way that I tried to make it, and as well as, the traditional forms of success around money and the like. But it was just another form of not, almost like lack of self-acceptance. And I trained really hard, and a lot of people would say, wow, you look great, and for your age, and, all the things. And that just, unfortunately, can perpetuate that idea that I'm doing the right thing for the right reasons. And what I found is in my pursuit of that success, I was pretty alienating, in some ways to my family, because I was so focused on this fitness thing and being the best version of myself, that I was lacking real connection, not just to my family, but to myself. And, as I woke up to what was going on, and I would say that happened probably around 2017, I physically started to soften. I lost some muscle and backed off the training. And it was the first step of me starting to open up and not, try to live in this comparative nature of what everybody else is doing and see if I can be as good or better. And again, fitness can just be one of those avenues. And I would say, more recently, I've been able to be in a good relationship with that through training, some intense workouts from time to time, and taking time off when, as you know, over the past week, I've been dealing with a little something in the chest and have backed off the training. And that would have been really difficult for me back then. I don't know that I really would have been able to do it. But today, I feel really good. I did a light workout before I got on today just to move a little blood and not punish myself. But it was the training was such an integral part of this unlearning for me, and to tuning into what do I actually need right now. As you know, like I love to do cold plunge and sauna and these other biohacking modalities that can be really beneficial, except when they're stacked on one another day after day after day with hard training and the stress of life and trying to create what I'm trying to create with my podcast, The Great Unlearn, and, putting out more media. It becomes too much on the system. I didn't have the connection to my body back then to say, oh, you shouldn't cold plunge today. It's going to be a little too much stress on your body, and you can work out, but you're going to need to go really light today. And it's just all this like more intuitive work that I've really been orienting towards. It's what made me a really good trader. You know, being a trader, I was on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Sure, there's a lot of math involved. There's, the mind's involved in that sense, but it's very much a sense of, does this feel like the right trade, and being able to pull the trigger on these trades when it maybe doesn't make sense with the math. And so that's, I've started to recognize that was my gift as a trader, and it's my gift as a human. And I think it's all our gift is to tune into that intuitive nature. And we can only do that when we can get out of the mind. And training can be great for that. When we're too much in the mind to go really tire the body, for me, it allows my mind to turn down a little bit, and then ideas can flow through from what I'm really meant to be doing versus what I think I should be doing.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, the first thing that sort of stands out there to kind of anchor on the last point is this sort of rigidity, right? And if we look at, I think it was Aristotle's golden mean, right, of too much versus not enough. And if you're playing, say, the algorithm of social media, the business landscape, you're rewarded for these things that are oftentimes addictions, right? Like addictions are not the cocaine, sex, and gambling. They're your relationship to yoga, to meditation, to cold plunges, to good things, to being a workaholic, and especially those type of addictions that, as we know, they get rewarded, right? Not only by society and by status, within ourselves more dangerously, right? Of like, man, I'm killing it, I'm making it, to the detriment of us falling on the other side of that golden mean of one, a blind spot, which is the most sort of pernicious thing about it. We don't know that we don't know. And then our family and our situation starts to, develop their sort of pathologies. And so I think calling out that sort of, aspect of the landscape, whether it's on the trading room floor, in business, as a person trying to stay fit and live a healthy life, as somebody who's naturally overachieving or working towards creating value, it's difficult if you are not aware of rigidity being a factor and of playing your own rules, right? So it sounds like you started to wake up, as you mentioned, in unlearning to figure out what your rules were. Was there a turning point that helped you not try to measure by somebody else's race, to not fall into, the mimetic traps of just miming what, this entrepreneur, this fitness guy, or this sort of person did, that helped you establish your own sort of principles as it pertained to you without affecting the more fundamental things of life, love, unlearning, learning, etc.?
Yeah, that's really, really well articulated. And I would say that rigidity was my middle name. And I didn't know any better. My wife did. She kept saying, God, you're doing all these things, but you're so goddamn rigid. Like just, this idea, and it's a good friend of mine, Boyd Vardy, kind of introduced it to me, to have enough structure in your life to leave the structure. So don't be so rigid with it, but set it up. It could be daily habits. It could be anything within that, but have a framework that you're able to leave that framework. And, I would say if there was one moment that I could point to, it was in 2017, October 1st, I was in Las Vegas at the Route 91 music festival mass shooting. And, while I was at the concert, while the shooting was happening, something shifted in me. I had this sense that nothing that I had worked so hard to build and create, and this facade, none of it was there to save me in that moment. And there was nothing I could really do except surrender to the situation. I didn't know what was actually going on. I didn't know if it was one person or if there were many, and if there were people that were going to come onto the concert grounds and, have their way with us. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but I just kind of laid everything down. And when I left, I went on a journey. I would say it took me about 18 months to figure what was going on, but I started to question everything. And at first it's terrifying because, as I would say in particular, as men, we live in certainty. We do things with certain goals in mind. Our partners come to us. You know, most of the time they don't want the certainty, but that's what we usually show up with.
Hmm.
And that decisiveness can be really beneficial, especially for me as a trader and to navigate life. The the issue comes when uncertainty is introduced. And for me, just sitting in that long enough to question nearly everything, and that's what really became the backbone of this unlearning journey for me. What is real? What is real for me? What is true for me? I know what I've been told. I know what I've been shown, but what does my experience actually show me as my truth? And getting to the other side of that um, was a massive weight off my shoulders, because in that kind of when they call it the dark night of the soul, whatever you want to call it, that uncertainty, it can be terrifying, especially when you've built this whole identity around success and showing up a particular way. And it's like, well, what if none of these things matter? Or what if they don't matter as much as I thought they did, or in the same way? And being able to separate from that and see that these things were just things that I did or do to make a living, or these different masks that I put on to show up in different ways. What if that's just a part of who I am, but really deep down there's this greater kind of soul calling that's really is the one that I want in the driver's seat. And it's like just trying to give way to that has been, I would say, over the past 6-7 years, has been my work. And there are times when I'm in beautiful flow with it. And there are times when I feel like it's back in 2013 and what just happened, you know? And I think being able to have some grace for myself around that and a little humor, and to remind myself that I am human. But that's part of, it's part of what I'm trying to share, particularly with the podcast, and bringing people on there who are going through their own unlearning, and in the many different ways that we're all called to it. And I love the podcast as a platform to just ping the listeners for, is there just any nugget in there that resonates with you in your own life, and can that inspire you to just make a shift or to go a little easier on yourself? Like, look, we're all a bit messed up. We're all trying to do this thing. We've all been indoctrinated with a lot of conditioning by a lot of people that are well-meaning. Some not so much, but that's neither here nor there. And so just to be able to be kind of in the experience, and I would say the biggest thing that came to me through this was just trying to be curious about it.
Sure. There's a expansiveness and curiosity, right? Like back to even traumatic experiences, right? Like a shooting, divorce, death, life. Life will bring us experiences. And more often than not, I believe, if we are not intentionally, which is sort of attention in and of itself, if we're not intentionally seeking some resistance, then naturally life can throw it our way, or we will manifest it, or it's just life that happens. But I like the idea of, I mean, it's not even that I like it. I think it's maybe some sort of truthism of some sort, of just the biggest, baddest motherfucker can still get killed. You could train as hard as you can. You could be the richest person. You could be the smartest. We've heard there's always someone tougher, someone smarter, but it doesn't matter if you're in a concert, if you're in any sort of situation where no matter what you've done, your life could end. And that sort of finiteness, that finity of life can really anchor us. And without having to experience trauma, unfortunately, sometimes we do need the dark nights of the soul as different levels, capital T or lowercase t trauma. They're the things that will sometimes wake us up better than anything. And they're the things that sometimes, I believe, are what we need, right? And so if we look at what we've experienced at different levels, we can use those as signals to sort of anchor us back to what you said, the curiosity. Because again, it's not a one size fits all, right? It's a journey, as you said. We're all trying to figure it out. Nobody knows how it all ends, right? We all have an idea, we have perceptions. As you said, we've been programmed by society, by well meaning parents, by agendas that aren't as well meaning. And at the end of the day, that's why it's funny for me for people who are like, oh, the government's after this. And if the government wants you, they're gonna get you. Like you could stress yourself out, you could set up your bunker, you could set up these sort of like do it, cool, but they're gonna get you, right? And it's one of those things where why not just again not be blind to things and depending on what any individual believes, it's more about ensuring that we are, like you said, curious and accept that uncertainty, which is a dance. We want to bring the order and chaos in alignment, and that is work. And that takes a sort of, it makes me think of like the flow versus deliberate practice argument. The flow people, if you look at like the science of it, Cal Newport was talking about this recently, like everything's flow. We want to get in flow. It's just flow. It's like, yeah, but if you study the best guitarists, the best orators, the best fighters, flow is what you get after you put in the deliberate practice work. And that shit sucks. That shit is your neurons are wiring, you feel frustrated. It's not just happy, lovey dovey stuff. And unfortunately, there are a lot of agendas, and we are complicit in it when we just want the easy shortcut in either direction. Easy shortcut of let me just hustle hard, let me just be 24/7 nonstop, or let me just let the woo woo energy come to me and make me rich, healthy, and wealthy, right? It's more of this thing of balancing that flow. And if we experience life as we experience things, learning to know that we don't know, and also to dance with it better, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and I love that idea that ultimately I think one of the greatest epiphanies I had was that there's so much that I don't know. Wow. And I'm not meant to know. I get to know it through my own experience, but just allowing for that idea to come in and to be okay with that. Again, back to this idea of certainty, back to the way we're unfortunately brought through the school system of certainty. There's a right answer for most all of it, and you're expected to get that right answer. And I think the most important things that I've found in life, there is no right answer. There's just curiosity and to have your own relationship with it. And it's not measurable. And that's challenging for a lot of us, particularly when we like a scoreboard to see if we did a good job. And I think it goes back to this idea of structure to leave structure, form to leave form. You need to put those reps in. If your meditation practice sucks right now and you can't get it, keep showing up. And I only speak from experience. I've had kind of a long bout with it in some ways where I feel like it finally popped about 6 weeks ago. It's like, oh, this is what it can be like. And it was this idea, like the heart finally opened, I felt like. And my meditation practice went from a grueling 5, 7, 10 minutes of seemingly nothingness to 30 minutes of deep connection to each member of my family, to the work that I'm currently doing, to the work that I'm meant to be doing. And it all unfolded in a way that I wouldn't have expected because I had never experienced that. But it was because I believe it was because I continued to do the work. Even when it was hard, it didn't seem to bear any fruit. It's this idea of continuing to cultivate the soil so that when, at the lack of sounding woo-woo, like when the soul is ready, those things start to come through. But it can be super frustrating when you don't feel like you're going anywhere. And up until a few months ago, I felt like I spent the better part of 3 years in this flowy state that really wasn't bearing any fruit. And I finally woke up to it. Like, what, dude, like something needs to change because you've been in this state. And at that point, I hadn't really measured how long, but it's like, if you don't shift something, you're going to continue to be like this in a year, 4 years, 8 years, 12, whatever. And do you want to look back and have spent that time how you have the last 3 years? And I just didn't see that as being the path I wanted to travel. And so I just became more intentional around that. And I tell you, the biggest thing for me, there were a lot of factors I think that allowed me to kind of pop out of that kind of tunnely experience. But I would say in particular, it was this reliance on stimulants. And it was nicotine, it was a lot of caffeine, occasionally it was microdosing, occasionally it was Feel Free, which is a kava kratom product that I'm an investor in and that I really think is a tremendous product. But like anything, it's all in the dosing. And I was leaning heavily on that, as well as these other things. So I'd get up every day and I would just get on a regimen of whatever I felt like I needed to go and to produce. And it wasn't until early February, I was like, this has to stop because I can't continue on this path. There's something I'm missing. And what I realized was it was my natural ability to create energy, my chi, and my creativity was gone. I had really it felt like no direction. And I didn't have structure. I didn't have a daily practice beyond this, quote unquote meditation that was setting me up for success. And so as I came off of those things in kind of one fell swoop, first couple of days were hard. I was tired. I knew that was going to happen, so I just didn't schedule much for those days. I just rested, which isn't always easy for me. But I recognized that needed to happen. I needed to give myself that. And then by day 3, the energy started to build. And then I just kind of took off. And I've just been creating from that moment on. And I have such a vision for where I want to take, kind of this, what I'm meant to do in the world. And I'd never had that vision. And so it feels really good to have a North Star to kind of orient towards as I make decisions every day. You and I and everybody listening here, we're faced with a ton of decisions every day. And they can be really challenging. They were challenging for me when I didn't have any kind of North Star. It was very easy for me to rationalize and to make decisions that weren't in my best interest going forward. And so with these kind of bigger visions, I get to tune in to each of these decisions the best I can and decide if it's bringing me closer to these things that I want to create and bring into the world, or is it getting me further away from that? And I don't always choose, the one I would prefer to choose.
You're human.
And that's part of the journey. And I'm okay with that. And it's just recognizing that and not beating myself up about it.
That's so good. Yeah, and I think of, kind of a good time now is spring, right? We sow this sort of seed in the spring. And it sounds like that's what you came to, and what, if we go back to what we were talking about between deliberate practice work that is not sexy, it's not easy, it's difficult, annoying, hard, and then the flow state. And that's sort of you mentioned continuing to show up. That is us planting the seed now, even as you mentioned, when it's annoying, when we're not seeing results, trusting that there's longevity in that, right? And through these dark nights, or through this sort of working within the physical world, the metaphysical world, and then the woo-woo, the spirit, the other aspect, that's part of the dance, as we were first mentioning, right? Of making sure that you have the structure, you have the work, you're putting in the soil, the seeds, you're doing the actual thing that is required for a tree or your crop to grow. And then also practicing faith, and with grace, also tapping into that thing that is beyond us that we don't see, and not over indexing on any one of those, right? Because I feel like that's what gets us. Have there been any other sort of frameworks or tools that kind of help you balance that sort of self-activation and holistic growth? Because we've mentioned it's not it's not one thing or the other, and it applies to people differently. What sort of structure has or flow or any of these sort of things as far as tools have helped you?
I'd say, each day I have my non-negotiables. And I used to think that was a pretty rigid thing until I really anchored those in what I'm here to create. One of those is not a new concept, but to read 10 pages of self-improvement, self-help, some sort of nonfiction that is about creating a better connection for me and what I'm meant to be doing. And so I like to anchor with that, as well as I like to sweat or move every day. I feel like that's just a good practice. And for where I want to be in 25 years, it's really important for me to have an active body. It's important for me to connect to the goals I've set. And again, I was never a big goal setter. I never understood it. It was never taught to me in a way that I could connect to it. And as I was just mentioning, this idea of when setting these goals, the 25-year goals with a vision big enough to kind of hold it all, and then the annual goals, it allows me to move through my day with a lot more clarity. And so really just setting into that practice allows me to connect to what I'm meant to do for the day. And I do that every morning. I sit with those things. And throughout the day, I'll sit with my goals at least 3 times a day, just to remind myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's been a great refresher for me, because it can be easy without having any of that structure to just go with the flow through the day. And I would say, even with this bit of structure, there's a lot of really good flow for my day. And I think it's just continuing to refine this idea of structure to leave structure, without the rigidity. And when the rigidity comes in, just question, where is that coming from? And generally for me, it's this old pattern of wanting to achieve, sometimes for achievement's sake. And it's okay, because that idea, that mindset created a lot of abundance for me. And when that's the only tool, it can be super challenging. It's for me, it's that discernment around when to access that, to really go for something, and then when to just allow things to show up in my life and pay attention, and not feeling like I need to be the driving force of everything.
Yeah, that's huge, man. And one of the things that really, again, it's such a clear thing of how it's nobody can give you the formula, right? People can guide you and give you tools, but it's like Steve Jobs or your idol in business or whoever, they had to do things that got them where they got, right? Like you are where you are because sometimes, for better or worse, maybe despite of, maybe because of these tools. It was what we had, right? I've been working off fear from, say, my teens to my 20s, and that drove me, right? Then it was pride, and then it was anxiety, and then maybe a family came. Like, we all use what we have at our disposal. And so I think it's like those same people, the Jeff Bezos, will now tell you, hey, go do, the red light therapy and the ice bath. But they're speaking from a different position. And so, say a 20-year-old college graduate is like, yeah, I just need to do more of the ice baths and get more in this energy flow. And it's like, yeah, do that, but don't forget to get where he got, depending on, again, your own individual journey. That's not going to make it for you, right? The whole idea of replicating the outcome instead of the work. And so that sometimes can get confusing. And so what I hear you say is you've set up these guardrails that sometimes by accident, sometimes by sheer will, sometimes by grace, divine intervention, or just because of who we were, not always from the best burning, not always from the most clean burning fuel, right? It could have been, again, from anger, from resentment, from fear. I set a structure in my 20s, 19-year-old, trying to not be poor, trying to not be, taken advantage of, trying to, all of these things that were based on ideals that then, as we mature, if we are aware of it, life is going to give us a kick in the ass, or we're going to wisen up, or we're going to develop the discernment to then, as we mature, and maturity could be at any level of your life, right? We're maturing until we're 100 plus, which again, with this fitness will get us there in this sort of regimen. But it sounds like, yeah, having this frame of the structure helps us really pivot towards more clean burning fuel.
Yes, and I love that you brought that up. One of the things I'm very careful to do is to not kind of encourage anyone away from the experiences that I had that were challenging. Like, go follow all the fitness stuff and try to reverse engineer and do all those things. I think, again, it comes back to having your own experience. Don't take my word for it. Don't take your
Right.
word for it. Go do those things. And when they don't work for you, or maybe they do work for you, they just didn't work for me in the long run, but they did get me to the clarity that I have today in some of these areas. And there's going to be other things that happen today and going forward where I'm going to hit my head against the wall and have to do it the hard way until I figure out what the proper path is. But I think having your own experience, and again, don't just do all the cool biohacking things that I may be doing. Like live your life and be okay with what you're learning. And it's the classic, we never really learn much from our successes. It's when we get it wrong, in a sense, although that's even questionable.
Right.
But when we don't maybe go down the easiest path, that's when we really have our own aha moments and we understand and we know things versus knowing about them. And I think that's a big distinction. It's
Yeah.
why I love having, this idea of having your own experience. You get to know something intimately versus taking my word for it, your word for it, Ram Dass's word for it, Jeff Bezos, whoever. You'll just know about it, and that's not super helpful in
Yeah.
the long run.
That's so true. I hear too, like with, it sounds like we either come to this point or we're taught, some of us, maybe didn't have the best upbringing or we just had habits, right? And so learning about these things are not bad in and of themselves, right? There are tools that we need to try. But even when it comes down to it, back to the meditation, the yoga, anything that is good, you still have to take self-responsibility. Nobody's going to pay your bills. Nobody's going to come and save you, that whole idea. But you're the one that is having to take responsibility. So instead of you asking Andrew Tate or XYZ person how to do this thing or go about this way, like you need to look at what has brought me these results. What am I? And sometimes it's hard, right? Sometimes it's like I've been a shitty person or my character has not been up to par or my skill set is not, and as you mentioned, having the grace, having the humility to be like, that doesn't mean I'm worthless. That doesn't mean it's not possible. And that's where most of us, especially as men, but anybody in today's society, our social media driven society, or just modern day, can really be sort of wanting to abdicate that agency and let somebody else steer for us. And I think one of the best frameworks, again, this is what has helped me, is just fundamentally thinking about, which I think you mapped out really well, of just the mind, right? The intellect with your goal setting, right? The body of resistance training, right? This physical being of that training it to do hard. The spiritual, right? The connection to source, the connection to even your purpose can be spiritual, and emotions, right? The part of us that feels, that comes from that. Whatever that means for you, right? That sort of non-negotiables that you mentioned seem to touch on those things. So that's where we have to do the work of practicing that agency and be like, for me, I love nonfiction. I didn't read fiction for the longest time. And something within this sort of like emotional intellects, like let me pick up Steinbeck, right? And John Steinbeck will write some of the shit that like you would hear Carl Jung talk about in a very narrative like structure. And so that to me fills the emotional and the intellectual side of things. But it's what works for me until it doesn't or until it changes. And again, as I train my body, as I train my mind, it's sort of like finding those grooves within those quadrinities, right? Those ideas that make us up, and then fitting that in a place or in a position that takes work, takes you taking the agency. Yes, look at the pros, look at the cows, look at the, greats who are doing something in your community, in the world, but not for, you know, putting them on a pedestal, not for like hero worshiping, which we know is counterproductive for everybody, but for just a map and then applying it to your structure and your reality.
Yes, I love that. And it is very easy to put people up on a pedestal from the little slight view of their life that we're led into. And it does. It ends up putting us in a kind of lower position, and we really have no concept of that person's life. And I love using what they're doing as an inspiration. Like, what are they doing that actually works within my life? What are the principles behind it that I can incorporate? And then just give yourself the space to play with that. And, it's like it can become all so damn serious with this stuff. I mean, I know I speak from experience, and that's not fun either. That creates a whole different level of stress when we're trying to do all the things. Like, sheesh, I've been there, and I may go there again. I don't know. The idea is to pick up on it sooner rather than later when if and when it does happen. But I think this idea too, I love the idea of reading fiction. When you start to notice those nuggets of real world kind of, whether it's Jungian psychology or something, you read in a Adyashanti book, but it's like, I always found that so cool. Like, oh, this book is so much deeper than I would have thought.
Yeah,
Right. And
that's
can
so
be
true.
really fun to read in a different ways, to download these principles that can be really these guiding principles in our life.
Yeah. Yeah. And how would you, I feel like this is the best question in terms of framing what we would do. I don't have kids, right? And you as a father, how do you teach this sort of golden mean that we were talking about earlier? The not too much and the not enough aspect when it comes to certain things like maybe even like depth of knowledge, right? Like as you said, there's so much that we think we know at at a surface level, right? You were alluding something to that regard, and really sometimes it just takes the time and as we were saying, the grace. But how do you teach your kids? Because I know we know what we know from experience. That doesn't mean we always either have the depth of knowledge or that we can give the advice, but no advice I would imagine is as dire maybe as the advice we would give to our kids. So how do you teach them to live that sort of full engagement golden mean when it comes to, let's say, like competition, right? If any of them are in sports or academia or whatever it is, you have to let them learn, but how do you give them that guidance for the golden mean without being helicopter parent, etc.?
Yeah, it's the same way I try to live my life, and it's allow them to have their own experience. And if I see my son who's really competitive in basketball, I see him acting in a way that I think he's acting like an asshole or something like that. I won't scold him for it, but I'll just get curious. Like, hey, what's going on? And generally, when I do that, my perception of why he's acting like that is completely off because
Mm,
something else is going on with him. And it maybe has nothing to do with basketball or his teammates. There's just something in his life is creating anxiety. And so then he's putting all these eggs in basketball. And when that doesn't go well, he gets super frustrated because that's one of the things he excels at. And so it's just always a reminder for me that what I'm seeing on the surface is not what's going on. And I mean, for better or for worse, my kids are 21, 18, and 16. We've really tried to give them the space to have their own life experience. Not to say we don't parent and guide and do that, but we are definitely not helicopter parents. And we want to continue to build trust with them so that when they do something that maybe isn't great, it's not automatically a punishment and a consequence. It's, let's talk about this. And maybe sometimes there is an appropriate consequence for it, but we don't jump to that like I think a lot of parents tend to. We want to just continue to understand what's going on because a lot of times your kid's not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. So like, let's figure out what is creating that tension, that anxiety, whatever it may be in them. And again, like I said earlier, it just comes back to being curious
Hmm.
and not thinking I'm so smart that I know exactly what's going on in their life. And I may have an idea and be right about like a major thing, but there's so many other little things in all of our lives that affect the way we show up or don't show up and act and lose our shit, that it's like that for everybody. And my kids aren't a reflection of me in the sense that I think a lot of parents think they are. And so I want them to be their own individual souls and to live their life and to know that I'm always here no matter what they do. Doesn't mean I won't be a little bit bummed about a decision here and there. I will be, and I'll let them know in a way that hopefully I can couch it through some questions. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes I get right to the point and say that was super fucked up, but yeah, it's just having an open dialogue and really trying to listen and creating the space where they can actually share and they don't feel the fear of getting in trouble for them wanting to, come clean.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think with that sort of advice that we give, right? And you pointed out something really powerful, which is like you said, it's for everybody, right? We don't know. We think we're acting this way. We think our kid, our neighbor, the random stranger that cut you off is acting in a certain way, but we don't know. And so it's like advice, right? Like we would give you great advice if we love you. If I've talked to a friend, a lot of friends of mine that have kids, they'll tell me what they would say. And sometimes I watch them, I'm like, you should tell yourself that exact same thing you just told your kid, right? And I'm like, sometimes by hearing them say that, it's like, wow, that's advice that my inner child or your inner child or all of our inner child needed to hear. And I think that's a huge anchor point of having that sort of grace and having that space, not only for the other, right? Because you as a parent, you as an entrepreneur, you as a member of society, as part of a community, you will reflect how your business operates, how your family operates to some extent, right? There's other people, they're their own individuals, but to some extent there is a reflection of that, especially if you're trying to lead, especially if you are, sort of managing or again, back to providing service and value, you're in a position of responsibility that requires you to have this, again, paradoxical grace that is sometimes back to what we originally started with. It it sometimes butts up against this hard driven, we gotta go 100 miles per hour, we gotta kill the enemy, we gotta stay ready, like that kind of thing, which has its place in time, but without that grace and that space and that curiosity, our kids are not going to feel it, right? We're not going to feel it in our inner kid, right? And the same things that we know intellectually, back to depth of knowledge, as we give ourselves the experience in time and space, that is a good, I think, picture of like how much we're always ready to learn. Because the more we do that for others, the more we can do that for ourselves. It's like that cycle. The more we do that for ourselves, even sometimes where words don't even have to be said, sometimes with kids in either direction. The parent that just looks at their kid and their kid's like afraid. But then that kid may be orderly and structured. That kid may not come back home. That kid may not bring his grandchildren back home, right? Or the parent that sees his kid or the kid that sees their parent and they don't have to say anything. And sometimes it's this loving thing. And they may not be a perfect kid or they'll correct themselves based on what you set up as structure, but they're learning their own thing and that trust is there. So there's not only just a good human, but there's somebody who will be in your life as grandchildren come and as that kind of, full life experience comes, when you say.
Yes, and it's this idea that, for my kids, I want them to feel seen and heard and their feelings validated, even if I don't necessarily agree with their assessment of their friend or whatever they're having a hard time with. They need to be validated because their feelings are their feelings. It doesn't mean I agree with them, but they need to be seen and heard. And I think that is just continuing to build that trust. And, ideally if and when the shit hits the fan with any of them, I really want to be the first phone call. I want them to know that they can trust me to give them advice or just get them out of a spot.
Yeah.
Not because I'm always going to get them out of a spot, but because they know that I'm not going to jump to conclusions and try to, penalize them for some place where they kind of fucked up.
That's good. Yeah, that's true. In terms of even what we need for ourselves, if they feel seen and heard, why wouldn't they act somewhat in accordance with what they know, right? Or at least feel the safe space. And back to ourselves. If we are wanting and asking, or at least we desire for the people that we love to be seen and heard, it goes back to that reflection, right? We have to see and hear ourselves. So, with that, what sort of, maybe programming, as you and I think initially started talking about when you and I first connected, when we're trying to achieve these things and sometimes these rewarding mechanisms or experiences that tell us we're doing a good job, but they can lead us to not see or hear our calling, to not see or hear our journey. What advice or what experience has helped you again in sort of finding this curiosity and this mindfulness to catch yourself? Like you said, we are human and we may find phases and times where we will steer in that direction more. But what do you think will help you, or what would you share to somebody, whether it's your kid or a client or our audience, especially if they're leading teams, to come back to that sort of curiosity as we are naturally drawn sometimes by these factors that put us in this other mode, if that makes sense.
Yeah. For me, it's when I feel like I'm in this super driven, tight kind of tunnel vision. This is what needs to happen. And with the caveat that sometimes that's what's required for the task at hand. But when I'm finding that's my MO from day to day, it's just like this curiosity, like why? Like what's the goal here? It's this idea of curiosity and what is driving. Am I inspired by the work I'm doing? Or is there something underneath it? My need for acceptance, my need to be successful, my need to do these things to earn love, which is a childhood thing of mine. And like I said, it's okay to tap into these pieces of ourselves. I love Adyashante's couching of this idea of resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are quite frankly, are the things that we do to get hired for a job that make us good employees.
Okay.
And the eulogy virtues are those things that we want people to say about us, at our funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we wake up to the second half of life, or at least for me, it was this great recognition that all those resume things were really cool and they created some cool opportunities for me. And I don't want people to talk about any of that shit at my funeral. I want to be something different than that. And it doesn't mean that you eschew the resume piece when kind of creating this eulogy path. It means that there is a coming together of the two and the balancing. And that's really, for me, has been the dance of how can I walk with a foot on both paths together, in balance, in harmony, to be able to do on the one hand and to be. And ultimately, to be able to achieve that, there's a greater sense of being that I think needs to hold that container. Because it's pretty easy to be when you're not doing anything.
Right.
And I think we can all resonate with doing without being. But marrying those two, which again, there's no real way to score it at home except to tune in to how you feel. And are you inspired when you wake up to go get on with your day? And frankly, when you go to bed at night, are you excited to wake up the next day to do the things that you're called to do? And I think that's probably been the biggest indicator for me, is that when I'm going to bed at night, just the excitement of waking up the next day. And it doesn't always happen, but when I'm in that space, it's magic. I know that I can create whatever I want to create. I just need to wake up the next day.
That's big. Yeah, the doing and being is big. And even I think the big underlying thing there too is, if we live 1,000 days, we can expect all 1,000 of them to be 100%, right? So as we
Yes.
go into the being and doing, accepting that shitty days will be there. There's just the law of statistics. Shitty people will be there, and it's okay, right? They're exactly as they need to be. So for me, that was one of the biggest eye openers. Is like, just because you feel it doesn't mean it's so, and being aware of like, hey, I may feel crummy, I may feel this. It doesn't mean it's like this forever, right? And back to like training, sometimes that sort of wiring of over anxious was what made me get activated and act, proactively, or it worked until it didn't. And back to this balance of it's okay to feel shitty and things might still be moving exactly. Just like on the other side, it's okay to feel great. And if you're measuring by somebody else's score or the algorithm, great feelings don't mean great things, right? If you're just on a high and on this thing, that doesn't mean you're moving forward. So I love
Yes.
that, man. I'm gonna kind of highlight what it stood out for me, and then please let me know if I missed anything or anything you want to add on. So, first is the sort of course that you're running in the race as an individual, making sure that you understand having structure to leave structure. I think that's a powerful guide for running your own race, but also building that sort of order and chaos that we need to manage uncertainty. The second point is questioning the balance between getting out of our head and in our lives, right? You mentioned getting into our body as a way to both get out of our head, but also remembering the soul aspect of that. We can get into our bodies as well as be intellectually driven and goal driven, but the soul aspect is a big part that will help us discern a bit better. The next point is just knowing that everybody's trying to figure out. Nobody knows what the fuck is going on, right? Even your greats, everybody has some sort of luck. Everybody has some sort of good and bad luck. And you need to sort of figure it out on your own, take models, understand there are ways to learn to not have to reinvent the wheel, but nobody knows what's going on to some extent, right? And I think that lends itself to the next point of just giving yourself grace, giving yourself this sort of, I think, door that lets you get into this curiosity. Walking through the grace helps you. You mentioned, again, back to I think Aristotle, it's like the less you know, the more you know that you don't know, right? It's like that saying about the greater the shoreline of your knowledge grows, the vastness of the oceans of what you don't know comes to mind, right? Like you more you know, the more you see how vast this ocean is. And
I like that.
lastly, again, you are not what you do, but be. And that balance of eulogy and resume doesn't mean the resume is worthless and just, be a hippie and live out on wherever. Nothing wrong with hippies. But
Yeah.
just, having this sort of balance of being and doing in a way that is productive to who you are, right? And to also, I think, again, live really unlearned and at your highest potential. Anything else that you'd want to add there that I might have missed?
No, I mean that was a beautiful recap. I guess the only other thing I'd say is this idea of us kind of tilling the soil and still doing that work. There's also this idea of weeding the garden too,
Mm,
and really starting to remove the things that are getting in the way. And if we are quiet with ourselves and we really ask, is this really supporting the work I'm doing, or is it getting in the way? For me, it was, as I mentioned, my reliance on stimulants. And that dependence was really hindering my ability to move forward. And it took me a while to get honest with myself about that. And when I finally did, and I had the courage to just say, I'm done, everything changed. And so I think there is this really taking stock of our lives. And I'm not saying overhaul everything. I'm saying just start to remove some things that are really getting in the way of you being able to create the garden that you really are aspiring to bring to the world.
that's beautiful, brother. Thank you so much. Besides the Great Unlearn podcast, you can find on all the platforms. Anything else that we could join to follow your journey? Anything else you want to plug in?
I would say just I'm on pretty active on Instagram, cal.callahan, and then the website for the podcast and everything else is thegreatunlearn.com.
Beautiful. Cal lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, 3 kids, 2 dogs, and a pig named Petunia. Cal's own podcast, again, The Great Unlearn, shares conversations with some of today's leading experts and performers to help men and women unlearn the way in a new way of being. Thank you so much for being on, Cal. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, brother. This was awesome.